Okay. We are live right now, so let's just give it a minute or two for people to enter the room, as we usually do. See that we have Chase on board with us here. He says, hurry up. All right, we're gonna get started. Okay.
Yep.
All right. So welcome everybody. This is Paul Gazzone, associate principal at Oceanside High School. I'm here with Allison, Dr. Glickman Rogers, and principal of Oceanside Middle School. And our guest for today is Caleb Stratton. Now, Caleb, just so you know, we like to keep it light in here. We are in our homes, right? We're not in our offices. So rather than refer to ourselves by our official titles, please feel free to call me Paul, call Allison, and we're going to call you Caleb, if that's okay with you.
Of course. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate being
here. Sure. So as we always like to do, we like to ask people to, our viewers, to tell us who you are, let us know where you're from, what school you're at. Maybe we'll give you a good shout out. You have that comment box right on the right. So take a moment, take a second and do that. And while you guys are letting us know who you are, we're going to talk about Caleb and his position, which is sounds pretty extensive. It's a Chief Resiliency Officer and Business Administrator for Hoboken, New Jersey. So, Caleb, why don't you start by telling me what that means? And that's a long title, so I'm going to put that in the chat box for people to see.
Sounds good.
So, yeah, what is it you do?
So, the Chief Resilience Officer position was something that was stood up by the Rockefeller Foundation in response to the events of Hurricane Sandy, and it stemmed from lessons learned out of Hurricane Katrina. So my primary responsibility is Chief Resiliency Officer for the city of Hoboken, which is on the west side of the Hudson River, 55,000 people in a mile square. We have 550 employees, and so I work on risk reduction and adapting to climate change. The city systems that we work in were really built at the turn of the century, and we're a waterfront community. So we're working on projects that deal with rainfall flooding, coastal flooding, upgrading infrastructure, adapting policies so that we can confront the challenges of the 21st century, and doing that with a broader peer group of chief resiliency officers that span across the United States and throughout the world. And it's kind of the movement to have a chief resiliency officer that's working on risk mitigation and adaptation is similar to what you might consider with like a sustainability officer. So that was like a big thing that started getting people understanding we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and change consumption practices. Resiliency is looking at the immediate actions that a city can take. So that being said, the business administrator side of it is really kind of our financial and programmatic, just business as usual. So we have a number of different directors that I work with and staff members to kind of run city operations.
Great. So,
Paul, before we move on, let's just help the kids, especially the middle school kids, like break down resiliency officer. So the word resilience usually means like to bounce back. You know, how do you get back on your feet? So a resiliency officer for Hoboken would help the city deal with adversity, anything that might affect the city, whether it be something like a hurricane or, maybe even after, the coronavirus, right? Like how does the city get back on its feet? And you're in charge of bringing people together, organizations, making decisions to help the city overcome whatever the challenge might have been. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I wish I could have said it that well myself.
Well, I have a middle school mind, so I'm processing it like a 13-year-old.
I'm somewhere in the middle, so there we go.
Sorry. I'm also a professor, and so sometimes I get excited. I use big words, like I just get ahead of myself. So I apologize for that.
So Caleb, why don't I want to just give a second. I want to give some shout outs to some of the people that are here, right? So first, big man Chase was really excited. So he's saying hi. I want to give a shout out to him. I also have James Clisty. He is a returning viewer. Excited to have you back, James. Joanna Palumbo from Team 7-4. Thank you for being here. Frank Capone from the high school. We have some counselors here, so and Vincent Capone's here. So just to give you an idea, we have some middle school learners, some high school learners, and I think I even saw an elementary learner here somewhere. So that's kind of the audience and the population that we're working with. But you said something really interesting, Kayla, and you brought up you learning from previous kind of natural disasters. You brought up Katrina, you brought up Sandy, and James over here actually, he's talking about we got hit hard by Sandy in Oceanside, and he's recommending, and we might have something in a different title, but about Sandy, like what did you learn? Were you in this position for Sandy? Did you work in this area for Sandy? What were some things that were learned from Sandy? Just out of curiosity, because we, as a community here, we did get hit pretty hard.
Sure. So I was working for the city in a different capacity during Hurricane Sandy. And we learned that we have really strong social cohesion, and there was a lot of support in the community, helping people that may not have been able to help themselves. And one of the lessons learned was having a strong community emergency response team. And our community emergency response team is a group of individuals that volunteer to help support the distribution of information. So if you remember back to Sandy, we were out, didn't have power for a week or two. We went back to really just simple writing on whiteboards, handing out flyers, and our community emergency response team organized donated resources and volunteers. And I think that that 100-member team was managing 5,000 volunteers. And so right now, as Chief Resiliency Officer, hold on, my laptop's going to sleep here. Right now, as Chief Resiliency Officer, I'm performing the same functions for the COVID-19 response, and I am responsible for working with our Office of Emergency Management, which is a little bit different of a group than our traditional police or fire departments. Emergency management are the individuals that are making requests for protective equipment. They're organizing testing centers, and they're providing policy for us as government officials on what the best practices are. So you might have seen in the news recently, Hoboken is implementing a self-isolation policy. We've closed bars and restaurants. All of those external policy decisions intersect with my responsibilities as Chief Resiliency Officer, as I provide advice and recommendations to our policymakers at the Office of Emergency Management and in the Mayor's office.
That sounds pretty cool. It sounds like you're a pretty big deal over there and making some policy changes and some influence. So talking about cool and interesting, what would you say is the most interesting part of your job?
So I have always been fascinated by architecture and building, and I think that we're in a tremendously interesting place in our society where technology and the ability to communicate like what we're doing today is intersecting with how we build businesses, how we run cities, how we conduct school. And so one of the most interesting things that I'm working on is looking at how we leverage technology into capital projects, for example. So after Hurricane Sandy, our team.
Can you just define capital projects for
capital projects are just construction. So our team was awarded $230 million to implement a coastal risk reduction measure so that the flooding that happened during Sandy basically will not happen again in the city. And so since 2014, we've been working on the implementation of that project. It's a program called Rebuild by Design. That project, New York State and New York City are doing similar projects. And the idea with that project is that we can build heavy infrastructure capital projects, but do it in a way that provides amenities to the community. So having a park be a way to reduce storm surge is really the kind of where technology, community feedback, and investments, like the rubber hits the road. So we are able to do photorealistic renderings of what the project is going to be. You can go to YouTube and look at what the project's going to look like, because we worked with Brooklyn Foundries, which is a gaming designer, to do an animation, which is a fly through of the existing city with the project superimposed on our existing landscape.
Seems pretty complicated.
It's really not, so if you've ever played a video game before, that is sometimes it's realistic, sometimes it's not realistic, but it's an interesting landscape that's created digitally. And so we are using those tools in architecture, and we are using those tools in city design to kind of help people understand and like lead them towards a lot of the times people think it's difficult to change. Like, for example, if you guys are undertaking a construction project to expand the school district, a lot of parents or students might say, what's it going to look like? How big is it going to be? What's it going to look like when we're in the building? And we have tools right now to create realities before we actually build them. And so we're doing the best we can to not only talk about what we're doing, like we use PowerPoint presentations, but actually begin to build these environments digitally before we construct them physically. And I'm fascinated by that as a education tool, and that's really how we're using it. It's not necessarily valuable in that as a standalone product, but leveraging it into community support, feedback, those kind of things, we're able to adapt our recommendations in real time to reflect what the community will support and ultimately finance and maintain.
So Caleb, just so I can maybe help the students to make a connection. When you drive through our neighborhood since Sandy, many of the homes, any new home has to be built like a certain amount of feet up in the air. So like our houses are like super tall. Any new house is super tall, and there's like a garage and really empty space underneath.
Right,
like it seems like there could be no bedrooms or like, no basement or something that could be damaged in a flood. And for some of the houses that were damaged before they could be repaired and rebuilt, the plans had to show that the house was going to be raised. That's what we keep hearing around here. The house is to be raised. Yep. So would your job, you spoke about policy. I would imagine that that's some sort of policy. It has to do with insurance to get the permit for your home to be built.
Yeah.
And to get insurance, it seems that the policy is the houses have to be raised. So is your job to offer that kind of advice to help make sure that nothing like Sandy happens again? So if the houses that are near the water are now raised, they won't have the same damage. Is that kind of what you do?
That's 100% accurate. And so if you can think about how difficult it might be for a homeowner to understand either federal or local rules and regulations, my group, I work with so zoning is our land use department, construction code are our inspection and building officials, and then we have state partners at the Department of Environmental Protection and with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, who administer the flood insurance programs. And after Sandy, we produced something called the Building Resilience Design Guidelines. And that's kind of just a handbook for people to understand, if you are undertaking new construction, here's the best way to do it. If you're remodeling your home, here's the best way to do it. And so our group aligns and creates consistency between those different guidelines. So when you drive through your community and you see someone with an elevated home, that's directly related to what we call a base flood elevation or design flood elevation. So that recommendation comes from the federal government. It's administered locally, and that base flood or design flood elevation means the lowest horizontal floor has to be above that occupiable floor in a home. So what that means is you're kind of changing the design of the foundation. So a traditional home might be built on grade and have a foundation that's below ground. What you're seeing in your community is an elevated foundation so that you don't have bedrooms, living rooms, kitchens getting flooded. The water's able to come past underneath the home and then go back out. And what that, and we call that in risk reduction, is you're kind of in both a cost and a time perspective, you're reducing how long it takes a community to recover. And reducing recovery is like a measure of resilience of a community.
So,
Paul, I just want to know, I mean, what would you say then? What's your skill set? Like, what are you, what
wait,
kind
Allison,
of
before we get there, I want to make a quick point because Kayla, you brought up you work with people that create animations and models and designs of you come up with an idea and you say, hey, we want you to make a model of what this would look like potentially, right? So something that as educators, we always look to speak with students about making connections and where their experiences at the middle level and the high school level, where that could take them further down the road. So for those of you who are listening, I know a lot of you guys are into your video games, right? A lot of you are into animation. You're at the high school, maybe you're taking like an intro to engineering design class, right? So you're taking these classes and you say, well, where is this going to take me later? Well, you know what? In 10 years, who knows? You could be working with Caleb, and he's going to say, "Hey, we have we just had a hurricane. We need a mock-up of a design that will work," and then you could tell him if it doesn't or not. So this is a real life connection in those jobs for those of you who are into animation, modeling, game design. And next Friday we will have a video game designer on here, so we're looking forward to that. But I just wanted to bring that up first before Allison you speak.
Yeah, I mean, what kind of skills do you need to take on a position like this? Like, what did I see?
Sure.
Someone just commented, what did you major in college? So if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of skills you had that made you want to pursue this career, what you studied in college.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up playing lacrosse and I grew up working construction. So it was a really simple way to make money, and it was something that I enjoyed doing. I liked understanding how kind of houses fit together and
like a puzzle.
Yeah, and it's really a number of different systems. The same way a car would be, the same way a boat would be, but it's just you have in a house you have a foundation, you have framing, you have insulation, electrical, plumbing. You have your roof, you have windows, and so like understanding how those things get put together was what piqued my interest early. And so there's vocational trade schools that teach those kind of things even at a young age, and there's always opportunities to just do some pretty simple manual labor. So that's how I got into. I always played with Legos growing up.
My little guy plays with them all the time.
I use Legos.
I play with them now too, actually. Yeah. So
I use Legos I continue to use Legos as a teaching tool because it helps you break down those systems. And when you begin to understand systems, you can begin to understand where the points of leverage are to drive greater impact on the systems that you're operating in. So a city is systems. So that started at a pretty young age for me. I studied urban planning as an undergraduate at Albany, and that was only because I had applied to an engineering program at RPI, but because of our practice schedule, I wasn't able to take coursework through them. And planning was my first entry point. I had a very good friend that was an ophthalmologist. Maybe that's not the right. He was an eye doctor, but before he became an eye doctor, he was working on derricks and oil rigs in like Idaho. And it was negative 40 degrees out, and he hit his hand with a hammer and broke his fingers while he was working.
Yikes.
And in that moment, he decided he's like, I'm going to use my mind for work instead of my body. And he went back to school and got his doctorate and started a successful practice. But that being said, I transitioning from working construction into planning, I thought it was a way to leverage things that I was interested in. So, and then also work in a vocation that I thought it was socially productive. So my father was a minister, my mom was a nurse. That kind of came naturally to me to think through working in government. So after my undergraduate degree, I went to get my master's in architecture, and to think through at a more practical level, how do I apply different skill sets to work in areas that I'm interested in? And then I ended up 2011 was Hurricane Irene, 2012 was Hurricane Sandy, And while I was in architecture school, I was focused on sustainable design, but that transitioned into kind of this resilient design field and ultimately to the position. So I was the first chief resiliency officer in the state of New Jersey, and now they have a chief resiliency officer at the state level, which is administering a lot of these similar risk reduction programs. And so how that kind of leading up to where we are today with COVID-19, I think that this event again is going to change the practice of risk reduction, and where it'll change my professional continuing education as well. So
So Caleb, try to think back to middle school, okay? Maybe even elementary school, maybe fifth grade, middle school. What things inspired you when you were younger to kind of move into this direction? And maybe what classes did you take? Maybe teachers, some things that teachers did that inspired you that you remember?
Oh, of course. So
motivated, you're a young guy, you're in a good position. Like what motivated you?
Two or three things stick out to me. The first is participating in athletics. I always liked working in a team environment, and I thrive when I'm being challenged. So I've always enjoyed that, and I had a lot of coaches that kind of pushed me physically, but I always thought that it transitioned somehow to ultimately what you wanted to work on. I had a handful, especially in middle school. It was mostly the English was one thing. Like I really enjoyed reading and was curious about how things worked, and having marrying kind of like your own self curiosity with an educator that is going to expand that area of curiosity. I found that through reading, and obviously math was another one of my focus areas that I kind of enjoyed, and I understood. It wasn't until later in life that I understood physics. I didn't take physics in high school. I was like, nah, I don't feel like it. But later, during my graduate work and working in architecture, I became to like, oh, okay, this is the language of how the world works. It is good for me to have a command of that. But going back to middle school, when you're able to work with whether it's an English teacher or a math teacher and broaden your area of understanding, you can start to say like, I don't really like this. And it's okay to say things like that. But until you're able to say, I have a command of this, it's difficult to put down a subject area until you kind of understand it. And then it's okay to kind of, I would say I always have been arcing towards things I'm interested in or I have a natural aptitude towards, but at a pretty young age, I realized that I needed to understand these other things that I might not be that good at. And because that gives me personally more license and more command of how I choose to apply myself moving forward.
Caleb, do you remember in middle school classes that allowed you to practice like problem solving and being creative, like your technology class?
Yeah.
That class where you built the bridge or the model dragster. Do you remember that experience at all?
I do. I remember that the dragster with the CO2 cartridge.
Yeah, we don't use the cartridge anymore, but we still do the cars.
Well, that's too bad. But mine was super badass, and I probably had the worst performing car in the class. Oh, I'm sorry. My car was perfect, but it performed terribly, and I was super disappointed because I'm competitive, and so that sticks out to me as just being those fun things, and definitely tech class and shop class and middle school. I think middle school is one of the most fun times because you are beginning to gather self-awareness, and I just remembered that that peer group specifically of friends that I have from that period of time, I'm still in touch with on a daily basis. I have a friend that ended up becoming an Army Ranger, and I've known him since 6th grade, and I was reviewing the edits of his leadership book last weekend. Like it's just so in middle school, yes, it's about curriculum, but like I also think it's really important to spend time with folks you just enjoy being around, and kind of like you're developing your sense of self, and I remember that it's difficult at times because everything is kind of, you're experiencing new things, so it's hyper exaggerated, kind of like your responses. But at the same time, you're experiencing new things, and and I have a lot of just good memories of first and trying different things, and so yeah, I think that this is a first. So that you guys are doing teaching curriculum online, and you'll remember this. So
do you in class now we use a computer generated model for the kids to design their dragsters. Are there any students out there that could comment on what you've been doing in technology to design your cars, your model cars? Any of the kids out there, have you guys been up to that yet in your STEM class with Miss Seminatori?
While they're typing, Caleb, I'm gonna bring up something that you mentioned.
Let me just say one point. So
yeah.
there's 3 programs that we use constantly. So that's computer assisted design, CAD.
Yep, that's what we use.
And then we use a program that's built by a company called ESRI, which is ArcMap.
Okay.
And that is that's how we do a lot of our mapping programs. And then we use the Adobe suite of to do a lot of our rendering programs. And between those 3 tools, you can design or build almost anything.
Yeah.
There's more sophisticated tools, but those 3 programs, having a command of those 3 programs will enable you to do a lot and to really understand a lot. And it's not there's free ways to learn them online right now.
The students are commenting. So we use Tinkercad, and that's what I was hoping they would say. And I wanted them to realize that that's probably a tool that you're using. So if this is something, as they develop that self-awareness, they find like, I'm curious about this, or I'm pretty good at this, I'm interested in learning more about this. There are many career opportunities that will allow you to like hone in on those that type of skill set. It's
really infinite right now. And I think that this COVID-19 work from home, you will have a job working with those tools in construction, design, architecture, city planning, whatever it might be. There's a lot of opportunities. So I just think that they're productive and fun to use, even if you want to do it to create art. So one of my favorite classes were always art. I'm a terrible artist, but my favorite classes were art classes, and you can begin to do things recreationally, and then it can. Where I think our economy is going is that there's going to be a better intersection between recreation and professional work, because you can develop competencies doing things recreationally that translate to something that's valuable to someone professionally. So I think that's a bright spot in our future, is using technology recreationally and then having that translate to something that you can be compensated for. That already happened. That happened in the gaming industry. Like that, when I was playing Nintendo when I was a little kid, no one told me that I was going to be able to be a professional gamer, but that's a legitimate career. Like most people aren't going to be NBA stars, but some people will be. So work hard.
Right.
That's great. So you mentioned earlier that you used to arc towards your strengths and stuff like that, and you become more aware of areas where you could enhance and say, how can I get stronger in those areas? And that kind of relates to kind of like a growth mindset and saying, well, I want to be better. I'm going to take my weakness or perceived weakness, and I want to strengthen it. Why do you think that's important? Why do you think first of all, it's okay to have a weakness, right? So I don't think we say that enough. I think people sometimes are too proud and saying, oh, I'm so strong, I don't have a weakness. But for kids out there, adults out there, it's okay to have a weakness and identify a weakness. But why is that important to try to work on your weakness?
So let me provide you an example of a challenge that I was confronted with and ultimately had to overcome that had a direct financial impact on me. So I have always wanted to get out of the field of planning and into the field of architecture. It's been a personal goal for me. It's why I did my master's in architecture. But professionally, it's where I've landed. And part of my resistance to professional development in that field is I have two nationally accredited professional certifications, which is based on a testing model and a curriculum. And the third one is a license through the state of New Jersey to act as a professional planner. So that professional planning license was a test and a curriculum that I disagreed with. I think that there was, the test itself was built in the 1980s and 1990s. It references case law that has been overturned. It points back to a state plan that hasn't been in effect since 2001. And so I thought it was BS. And I was like, I'm not going to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to test. I don't want to provide effort to take a test. Like, I don't want to do this. For me to get promoted into my new position, one of the civil service requirements was you need to have a professional planning license. So I could be stubborn and say, I don't want to take this test and it's BS and I disagree with this. Or I could have the discipline to learn the curriculum, even if it's wrong, to sit down and take the test, even if I disagree with it. And what that enabled me to do is to get a promotion, and I had a $10,000 salary increase. So having the discipline to do things that you don't want to do will translate to goals that you have set in front of yourself. So some of the things that you may not want to do on a daily basis, if you have the discipline to do those things, you can ultimately obtain things that you do want. And it's important to know, I'm stubborn. I also tend to I don't know what I disagree with authority or not take well to positions of authority. Like I acted out when I was in high school and middle school. That was a learning process for me to understand that if I can understand the system, I can affect how it's designed. So rather than acting out against it, I figured out how to, understand where to operate in and what things had to be followed, should be followed, could be followed. And getting my professional planning licenses was one of those things where I could have been obstinate and said, no, I want to continue to head in this direction, but I disciplined myself into getting that license. So that's just an example of one of the productive ways that doing things that you don't necessarily want to do can ultimately have a positive outcome.
All right, so I think we're going to end now. We're 30 minutes in. So Caleb, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. Super excited to have you. It's a career and profession that I don't think any of us even knew kind of really existed. So again, thank you. And
thanks for the invitation.
Not a problem. And just moving forward, everybody, so tomorrow we have Josh Sellup, who's the Vice President of Providence Equity. Monday, we have Louis Zirianis. He's a lawyer out in California. Then Tuesday, we have Jay Fielder, former Oceanside graduate and former NFL quarterback. So I know we're all looking forward to that. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for today.
Thank you.
See you guys
You're very
tomorrow.
welcome. Good luck,
Bye.
guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.